let's talk about mental health in Indo-Caribbean literature. I did a video late in 2020, I believe, and this was a video that was talking about trauma in Indo-Caribbean literature. 2020 was kind of the year where I really started diving into Indo-Caribbean lit. I was reading a ton, a ton of authors. I got introduced to Secrets We Kept by Crystal Sattel. What else? I got introduced to Shani Mootoo's work. I got introduced to Trauma by Elizabeth Jaikaran. There was so many titles that I was introduced to, and just in general I was doing a lot of research because I was putting out a lot of articles and writing for Brown Gal Diaries blog. So in the process I also learned quite a bit just through the things that I was doing, the research that I was doing and whatnot. So as I've kind of continued on this journey of reading and, diving more into Indo-Caribbean lit and things like that, there are just ongoing themes that really have stood out to me. That is trauma, mental health, and just women. And I mean, I know that's kind of vague, but it's just whether it's the treatment of women, the events that female characters go through in the books, and just the overall environment of female characters and what's expected of them in these books, because they are very reflective, of course, of Indo-Caribbean culture, and I think especially of the past. That's not to say that these things don't still happen right now in our current day, but I think it's very reminiscent of the past at the same time, because many of these books, not all, again, like I said, not all, but a lot of the books that I have read, some of them are by older authors. They were written in maybe the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and these are, authors who would have grown up through perhaps the 50s, 60s, 70s, so they were very much experiencing the post indentureship era, things that our grandparents more than likely would have experienced, that life that came after indentureship, when everybody was no longer sort of tied to these systems, but there was still this entire aftermath that came through from, slavery, indentureship, and now all of a sudden everyone just kind of had to pick up the pieces and adapt and figure out what their lives were going to be in these new places where they had found their generations now living. Most recently, two books that I read for the start of 2022 were A Silent Life by Ryhaan Shah, and I will pretty much just be using those two as kind of key references here, just because they're very recent in my head and what kind of triggered this this whole thought process. But I will probably refer to some other books that I've read as well along the way. In A Silent Life, and I also should mention I did review these in my last video, so if you want to see a review you can check those out as well. But in A Silent Life, our main character, and her name is Alia, she's very connected to her grandmother, her nanny, and one of the sort of storylines within the book is her figuring out what her grandmother's life was like before she went silent, hence why it's called A Silent Life. Nani doesn't speak. She very rarely speaks, and if she does, it doesn't really make sense. She's quiet, she sits in her rocking chair, and you can tell that she's very disturbed. There's something that had happened in her life that is what led her to now being silent and not speaking. I mean, right away this stands out, to me as somebody living in 2022 as like a mental health concern. Something, was a trigger, and that really, affected her mental health. And I think, and nowadays too, we really realize these connections. I think at the time the book was taking place might have been the 80s, the 70s, 80s roughly, and honestly, even until recent years, mental health hasn't fully been this thing that we talked about. I remember even to when I was in high school, which honestly wasn't that long ago. I'm only 25 now, but mental health wasn't something that we talked about. It wasn't something that anyone took into, you know, took into account back then. And it really wasn't until a few years later when I was in college that all of a sudden the mental health conversation more so started becoming a thing that was mainstream and something that was being covered. Bringing it back to A Silent Life, you know, Alia's grandmother, she was the voice of her community. She was not your average woman, somebody who was just, you know, very silent, you know, as so many women have been in the past. Unfortunately, they've had to, you know, endure things, be silent, be, you know, obedient, whether it was just a cultural expectation, the expectation of husbands, relationships, families, etc. You know, her nanny wasn't that person. She was revolutionary, basically. She was very much into politics, into helping her communities, into figuring out ways to help, you know, the workers who were in need of more wages, things like that. She was just a revolutionary person. And Alia's grandfather just was very different. His life trajectory was very different than his wife's, and you know, usually it's the man who takes on that role, not the woman. So that was really something that affected him. As a result of this sort of dynamic between the two of them, they clashed, of course, and it eventually led to a very big tragedy in you know, their lives. And I won't give that away just in case obviously anyone hasn't read the book, but it was a traumatic event that ultimately led to the deterioration of both of their mental health. And this, you know, this is just one of those things that I really couldn't help but think about. And then in Cereus Blooms at Night, that book as well, there is extreme tragedy, very just very horrific events that all come back to a character's mental health being compromised. In that book, Mala Ramchandran, her father, Chandan Ramchandran, he, you know, committed such horrific acts towards his family, towards his daughters, but it was because his mental health, you know, again, being able to recognize this, his mental health was completely deteriorated. He wasn't in his right mind, and he was just acting as per whatever was going on for him. And even so, we don't really get too much insight into that in the book, only to a certain extent. I think it's just a matter of being able to kind of recognize this. Even in reading these books, you know, they're not outwardly talking about mental health or saying, you know, this character is suffering from depression, anxiety, whatever the case might be, schizophrenia, I don't know. But it's quite clear that, I mean, I can't necessarily diagnose the characters or anything and say this is what they're suffering from, but it's very clear that there's mental health concerns. And I think, again, for so many of us in the Indo-Caribbean community, we know that mental health has absolutely been a taboo. And even in, you know, today's world where mental health is something that we talk about more often, it is still very taboo in some of our families, and it's just really not always recognized. Again, even though we're living in a day and time where, for the most part, the world is recognizing mental health. It's kind of sad to think in a way, because so often in the past, if somebody was very likely suffering from, you know, a mental health problem, our communities were so quick to say, you know, somebody was, you know, a mad woman, a madman, etc. Oh, they're crazy, things like that. And these are things that, again, like I've seen translate in these books that I've read. In A Silent Life, Alia, you know, once she gets married and everything, her partner's family doesn't know much about her grandmother, only to an extent, and they don't know that they don't know about her condition. But after Alia kind of goes through her own sort of breakdown, they get in contact with family members back home and find out that her grandmother is kind of known as this mad woman to an extent, because she doesn't speak, she hums. That's her thing, right? She sits in her rocking chair and she'll be humming. And they confront Alia and say, you didn't tell us about your grandmother, you didn't tell us that she is ill and, you know, not right in her mind, and, you know, how will this affect our grandchildren and you and your blood and, you know, whatever. But basically they felt like Alia was then tainted with this sort of mad blood, that she didn't tell them about, and they were very upset about that. And it was also the same thing in Cereus Blooms at Night. Chandin Ramchandin once had a very noble position in his community. He was well known, he was respected, and now people, you know, once obviously his mental health deteriorated, people really looked at him with pity, but they also looked down on him and didn't really want to be around him, let alone sometimes even have their children around his children, kind of knowing there are certain rumors as to what he had done to his daughters. But all of this to kind of say that I think in so much of these in these novels that we really see the effects that the lack of awareness around mental health had on our communities, as well as how it affected the female members of our communities. Like I said, in Cereus Blooms at Night, it is Chandin Ramchandin who kind of is that first person who is suffering from something, but it trickles down because he wasn't able to treat what he was going through. He acted out on his children, and eventually Mala ends up suffering from her own mental health problems, and it's very, very clear by the end of the book, or even honestly before that, that she is suffering something as a result of trauma. And same thing with Chandin. It was a sort of trauma that triggered his mental health to deteriorate. And again, bringing it back to A Silent Life, it was it was something that was traumatic that caused Alia's grandmother's mental health to deteriorate. And even for Alia herself, it was sort of a mix of things that caused her to have a breakdown at one point in the book, even though it's not as extreme as something that her grandmother dealt with, or even some of the other characters that I mentioned dealt with. But it's just, I really kind of think about this because even though these books are fiction, they are very much reflective, and it's by no means something that is reflective of the entire Indo-Caribbean society to just say, you know, oh, we're all like this or something like that. But it's very key things. It's very key things that we notice. And I think, you know, being in this place that we're at nowadays, so many of us, especially in newer generations, are very open to talking about mental health and sharing and just kind of spreading that awareness because we recognize it, whether we recognize it in our parents, in our grandparents, and even though, and this is why I always say this, just because a story is fictional doesn't mean it's not reflective, it's not real, and I know that kind of maybe might be a bit of a, you know, a bit of a tricky thing there, but these stories that I'm mentioning are fictional characters, fictional situations, so to speak, but they're not necessarily not real because these things have happened to people. I guarantee that, you know, there are people who can read these books and say, my family went through something very similar, my grandparents went through something very similar. So even though they are not literally based on a specific person, they are still very real and very real things that are going on. I think it kind of makes me realize how far we've come as a community, how far we've come in terms of recognizing these things again, because there's so many spaces nowadays where you know, we're talking about mental health. When you know, go on Instagram and things like that, there are a lot of Caribbean accounts that are talking about mental health in our communities, trying to put out resources. Right now I can even say, like, Brown Gal Diary, we have really decided to make mental health a big pillar and a focus for us this year in 2022, and we're working on putting together a directory of Indo-Caribbean therapists to help our community get in touch with people who can help them or their family if they are going through things and have that culturally specific connection. To kind of wrap up this little talk, I think what my message here is that if you are going through something that is mental health related, just know that, you know, you're not alone. And I know that that is kind of a very common thing to say, a very, you know, just kind of the regular line, but it's true. You're not alone, and so many generations before us have gone through these things, and it's so it's so nice to know that there's more resources available to us nowadays, and even to our family, that you can still access, even though sometimes it's tricky because we know, you know, family members, sometimes they're not on board, they still don't like to, you know, recognize these things, but you know, the help is out there, the resources are out there, and I think it's just really cool in a sense that we have access to all these things and we don't have to be in the dark as previous generations were. Whether it is through books, platforms, you know, different resources, talking to people, whatever the case is, you know, don't be afraid to find the things that will help you see yourself reflected, see your situations reflected, and maybe even inspire you to see what you can do different for your future generations. But that's all I kind of wanted to talk about today. These are just some things that have been on my mind. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, what your thoughts are about, you know, mental health and trauma within the Indo-Caribbean community. Like I mentioned, these things just seem to intersect so much, and it's very prevalent in you know, our literature, things like that, and hence why it just kind of is a topic that I keep coming back to. So definitely let me know your thoughts. So I will see you guys next week in my next video. Thank you so much for watching. Take care and stay safe. Bye.